Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's nice to be with you all this evening. I'm going to tell you a story. This story will start on Christmas Day, 1065, and it will conclude on Christmas Day, 1066. It was one of the most momentous years in English history. Its effects are still with us today. As a result of that year, England suffered terrible consequences as a result of the Norman occupation. For example, the historian Vitalis Florence of Worcester, writing in the 12th century, said that William laid waste to the country, slaughtering the inhabitants and inflicting every sort of evil without cessation. More than 100,000 people perished of murder or starvation. This is a side of the Norman conquest that's not readily spoke about, but we today have one word for that: genocide. The Normans carried out a campaign of genocide, especially of whole areas north of Derby up to the Scottish border. How did all this come about? What led to such events? Well, let's start then our story on Christmas Day, 1065. That day, the king was dying. The king was Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor was king and he was dying. Today we think it was sugar diabetes, but we can never be sure. But it seems that from his symptoms. Edward the Confessor, when he was a boy, had been driven out of England by the conquering Danes, and the Danes had their king Canute. Canute, as king, didn't want any rivals, and he drove out the Saxons. Edward's mother took him to her homeland. Her homeland was Normandy. And so he was brought up in Normandy under the protection of his mother under Duke William. Therefore, when he became king, he got a lot of Norman friends, and they were put into positions of great power. Now, even then, the English didn't like the French too much. For example, the Norman Robert of Jumièges was made Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Saxons hated that. They kicked him out. There was riots in Dover and drove him out, and they replaced Robert with an Englishman called Stigand. He became the Archbishop of Canterbury, but they had not gone through the Pope, and so the Pope excommunicated Stigand. Therefore, we had an excommunicated Archbishop of Canterbury. That figures prominently in the story that's coming to be told now. Edward had been forced to marry Earl Harold's sister, Edith. But we think that the marriage was not consummated, hence there was no children. He made a habit of praying constantly, and he did not want that wife that was forced on him. So he now, as a dying king, had no children. On the 12th night of Christmas, and in this time of the country, this time of history, the 12th night was celebrated as much as Christmas Day itself. It was a major festival. He got his family around him, and these are his last recorded words. Tell the Witan, I commend my wife, who was Harold's sister, to Earl Harold's care, and with her my whole kingdom. Now here we have a question. What was the Witan? The Witan was the embryo of a parliament. Yes, even back then, the Saxons had a form of parliament. Very few of the Saxon kings took control by inheritance. Most of them, including Alfred the Great, were elected. Not many people realize that, but the Witan was the powerful body that was able to elect kings. And the Witan was made up of earls, thanes, generals, and bishops. A thane is a Saxon name for a lord. Sadly, it would be another 600 years before any such body could again exert any influence or control over a king. It was the Normans that insisted on father to son inheritance. The Saxons, that was an anathema to them. They didn't do that. They elected the one they thought should be king. Who were the candidates? The first one was Prince Edgar Atheling, but he was only 13 years old. He was the grandson of a former king. But at 13 years old, it was no time to have a boy king. Harold, as Earl, had just come out of 10 years of war with the Welsh. And then we had problems, as always, with the northern borders with Scotland. Then on the east, you had the Danes, and in the south, the threat from Normandy. So it was no time for a boy king. Duke William said he had a claim, although it's laughable. His only claim, and listen to this, his only claim was that his grandfather's sister had been Queen of England. Not much of a claim, is it? And in fact, the Normans were hated by the English anyway. Then there was Earl Harold of Wessex. He was well liked, a good leader, tried and tested warrior. He'd been very successful in the wars with the Welsh. So he was elected as king. Now, the Normans tried to make out that you could not elect kings, but the Saxons did and always had done, even from Alfred the Great. So the Norman accusations were just propaganda. On the 12th day, then, the king was buried in Westminster Abbey. He had been the man who had founded that abbey, and the very first major ceremony within the Westminster Abbey was the funeral of its founder, Edward the Confessor. And you see on the right picture there, the sarcophagus of Edward, which is still this day in the same place it was all those years ago. So that was the first major ceremony on the 12th night of Christmas. Sorry, in the 12th morning of Christmas, the morning of the 12th day. In the afternoon, King Harold was crowned. Now, his coronation was not by Stigand, but the Bayeux Tapestry says it was. They say that to kind of illegitimize the coronation. But we know from the records that it was not Stigand, the excommunicated archbishop, but it was the Archbishop of York who crowned him. So the Bayeux Tapestry is Norman propaganda, trying to make out and justify their invasion. And in fact, throughout history, invaders have always tried to justify their invasion, often by lying propaganda, as we see with Putin at the moment. Now, this is the England that King Harold inherited. It was divided up into earldoms, great earldoms. In the south and west, we had Earl Harold himself as Earl of Wessex. In the east, we had Llythwyn, who was the brother of Earl Harold or King Harold, who had Kent and Essex. In East Anglia, we had Gwyth, who was another brother of Earl Harold. Three brothers controlling the whole of South England. In the north, there was Tostig, and Tostig was another brother of Harold. So all those brothers controlled most of England, except Tostig turned out to be a rather hateful, vicious, and nasty person, as you'll see as the story unfolds. He'd been so bad toward the Northumbrians that they drove him out, and he was exiled by Edward the Confessor. So he was driven out. In the center where we live today was Edwin. Edwin was of a different family. Now, some say that's where Edwinstowe gets its name from. When Tostig was driven out, Morcar was put in his place. And it just happens that Morcar was the brother of Earl Edwin. So there we have two brothers in the north, controlling the north, and three brothers in the south, controlling the south. Now, you've probably never heard of Morcar and Edwin, but I bet you've heard of their grandmother. Their grandmother was Lady Godiva. Harold's first act as king was to try and form an alliance between those brothers in the north and his brothers in the south, which was logical. And the best way of forming an alliance between those two families was to marry into their family. And Edwin and Morcar just happened to have a sister who was available. So he made an arrangement to go and marry their sister. Now, that might sound okay, except King Harold had what we would call today a common law wife or partner. He'd had 6 children with her. Her name was Edith Swanneck. But the records say the church had not recognized that marriage or that relationship, because it says in the records they were married in the Danish fashion, which we think means that she was probably pagan, and the church would not therefore accept it. So legally, he was free to go and marry the sister of Morcar and Edwin. Although I don't think Edith Swanneck would be too happy about that, but nevertheless, this is politics, and that's what happened. Tostig, he was now outlawed and full of hatred for his brothers who had had him driven out. He was seeking revenge, and this is the man that was the catalyst of everything that was going to come about this year. Tostig's wife, Judith, was the sister of Matilda. Well, who was Matilda? She was Duke William's wife. So through his marriage, he had very powerful connections to the Duke of Normandy, and he was going to use them. So he was now setting off to get revenge on his brothers. He sets off across the North Sea. Now remember, these are Viking ships, although they are Saxons, but they still had Viking ships. And he sets off across the North Sea. And he goes in February. Now, can you imagine sailing across the North Sea in an open longship, rowing with the cold winds and ice and frost? Wouldn't be very pleasant, would it? But he sets off. And first, he goes with 12 ships to King Sven of Denmark. He tries to get King Sven to help him invade England, but Sven, he's hesitant and says, no, he's not coming. Tostig is angry about that, but he goes off to another king, the King of Norway. The King of Norway is another Harold. His nickname is Hardrada or Hard Raider. So to avoid confusion between the two Harolds, I'm going to call him by his nickname, Hardrada. Now, Hardrada had been fighting as a warrior all his life, a true Viking, reputed to be 7 foot tall. He had been bodyguard to the emperors of Byzantium and his Viking troops. So he'd had a life of blood and war. Now then, he was not just the King of Norway. He had quite an empire. He was King of Norway, yes, but also of Iceland, the Isle of Man, Greenland, the Isles of Scotland, parts of Ireland, and the whole of northern Scotland. So here was a very powerful man indeed, and he was going to get this man on board. How? Tostig persuaded him that he had inherited the lands of King Canute, who was one of his forefathers. Therefore, because his forefathers were King Canute, he should have inherited the land of England. Tostig said he'd supply him with men and ships and inside information. So here we have, not only is this man a traitor to his country, but he's a traitor to his own brothers, a vicious, horrible man who would cause all the problems that we're about to see. Let's look at Duke William for a moment. There was a lovely, beautiful 16-year-old girl called Helena Harlotta. She took the eye of the Duke of Normandy, Robert. They had an illegitimate relationship and produced the bastard son, William, who became later Duke of Normandy. Helena Harlotta was a tanner's daughter. Now, if you know anything about tanning, it was a horrible, obnoxious, smelly trade. It was so bad that it was banned from being operated in cities, towns, and villages. They could only operate way outside of where people lived. One of the reasons was the horrible stench and smell, because they used human urine, animal urine, dog feces, and lots of other obnoxious substances to do the tanning. Where did they get the human urine from? The pubs would have leather buckets, and the leather buckets would get filled with urine, and the tanners would come and collect the buckets full of human urine for their trade. So the enemies of Duke William would often laugh at him and call him the son of a pisspot carrier, which didn't go down too well with Duke William, very proud of his father, Robert. Now, Robert said, I'll be away for a few months. I'm going to fight the Muslims. I'll be back, but I haven't got a legitimate son. While I'm away, my bastard son, William, will be Duke of Normandy. But he didn't come back. He got killed. And so at the age of 8, William was made Duke. Now, because he was so young, many barons and nobles wanted to kill him. And he spent most of his life as a child being hunted. In fact, one of his teachers was killed in Duke William's bedroom while the teacher tried to hide him. So this warped William. When you read and study William, he was a very warped character, as we saw at the very beginning of this talk, where he went on to kill over 100,000 Saxons later on. Now, Helena Harlotta later went on to marry William of Canterville, and she produced 2 legitimate sons, Robert, Count of Mortain, and Odo, Bishop of Bayeux. Yes, that's the guy that did the Bayeux tapestry. Now here we have 3 brothers with the same mother, but 2 fathers. They became the 3 most powerful warlords in Europe, and that's what they were, warlords. So from their mother's lowly beginning, these 3 controlled the whole of Northern Europe for quite some time, and they were vicious people. William's claim, well, this is laughable. The Witan would never have elected a Norman to become king. They didn't have the authority to do that. And also in the Council of Chelsea in the year 787, the synod stated that only legitimate kings could be chosen by the witan and bishops. Therefore, William didn't have a claim, although he made out he did. And we know that was lying propaganda. Edward the Confessor didn't have the right to promise the kingdom to him, as again he would claim in lying propaganda later. But he could not claim the throne without going through the witan. Why did Harold go to Normandy? Well, he went at an earlier time, and that was to get the release of his younger brother, who'd been held hostage by Duke William and one of his nephews. That was the reason he went to get them released and why he was in Normandy, not, as the Normans said later, to promise the kingdom of England to William. Again, Norman propaganda. Harold did not have the authority to hand that kingdom to William, nor did anyone else. The Bayeux Tapestry, therefore, was a tool of Norman propaganda, justifying their invasion of this country. Why then did these people want to attack England? Well, at that time, England was the wealthiest, most stable nation in Europe. It had the strongest currency, which was based on the silver penny. And it also had some of the most efficient tax gathering system. Pause there a while, because some things don't change. England was also highly cultured. The gold hoard found in 2009 in the county of Staffordshire illustrates that. This gold hoard shows just how wealthy the Saxon kingdoms were. Wonderful jewels. And we found out from analysing that these jewels were from all over the world, as far away as India and the Middle East. So they were great traders. These jewels had not been found in our country. The gold might have been, some of it, but not all of it. So here we have a great trading nation, even at that stage. So it was a prosperous nation. William hears of the coronation of King Harold, and he sends a delegation to King Harold. Now remember, a king is higher than a duke, but the duke asks Harold to become his vassal. The cheek, eh? The cheek of him. Here we have a legally elected king, and now a duke who is lower asks this king to become his vassal. Well, that was certainly not going to happen. The delegation were humiliated. They were beaten up, the hairs were shaved, the horses were whitewashed, they were sent back in sackcloth. A true insult. But by doing that, Harold knew he'd now got to mobilize his army. William needs support. Normandy by itself was not strong enough. So he goes to the Pope. Now, what we generally don't appreciate is that the Normans had been the Pope's protectors for many years. The Muslims had been attacking Sicily and Italy, but it was the Normans who had protected it. In fact, the Normans made a kingdom in Sicily, the remains of which are still prominent in that country today. So the Normans were the Pope's protectors, and now they're asking compensation. In other words, you owe us. And they sent to the Pope and said this: many Normans are now St. Peter's dukes and princes. The Pope will not forget the conquest of Apulia in Italy was blessed due to our Norman support. Our Norman brethren conquered it with relative ease. In other words, you owe us one. Then he adds, we'll remove Stigand and replace him with Robert of Jumièges. So now they've got the Pope on board. And by doing that, the Low Countries, which we now call Holland and Belgium, would come to join the Normans. And that's what the request for Pope support brought about. So Harold now knows he's got to mobilize. One of the interesting things about Saxon England is that they had full-time professional soldiers. That was unusual in those day and age, but they called them the housecarls, and these are fully paid up soldiers and quite fierce. Their method of fighting was not on horseback. They fought on foot, and they had a system which Alfred the Great had formulated, and that was a shield wall. And that shield wall had proved formidable. The Saxons were quite the strongest fighting army in Europe at that time. The Firrid were the part-time territorials who were required 1 month a year to do training for that role. And they would be called up when the king needed them. And this was now such a time. They never fought on horseback, which was quite strange. So now the housecarls and the Firrid are being mobilized.